Everyone out there on YouTube land, Dan here from Geekcast Radio doing another comic book review. This time I will be discussing Hot Lunch Special number 1, brought to us by the wonderful folks of Aftershock Comics, written and co-created by Eliot Rahal, art and co-created by Jorge Fornés, as well with lettering by Tyler Esposito. And I do apologize, I'm sure I said many of those names incorrectly. And if you watched my comic book haul video, you saw that I was really anticipating this issue for a lot of reasons. I have some experience with the creators, but really was things around it that had me highly anticipating this issue. I love the description of the book going in. I'm a huge fan of crime. I love crime, the genre and not the action, and kind of how it was describing itself, what it was kind of comparing itself to. I thought, like, that hits my sensibilities really well. That's exactly kind of the stories I like, and a lot of creators I highly respect, like Zach Thompson, had a lot of praise to say for this issue. And Zach Thompson, who's doing her Infernal Descent currently and Relay for Aftershock Comics, I'm like, I really like his work. I mean, I got to check it out and see if I agree with his assessment. And I got to say, after this first issue, I highly agree with what he was saying. And this is one of I loved and adored this issue a great deal. It's one of the best first issues I've read all year. And if it follows through with much of what, the premise and the promise of this first issue could go down, in my opinion, as one of the best new series of the year. And I hesitate to put that much praise on a book because it may sound hyperbolic. It just sounds like you're setting people up to be disappointed, because if they read it and it's not the best thing ever, it just sounds like it's overrated or whatever verbiage you want to throw at it. And I could see some people reading this and, obviously not agreeing with my assessment, maybe not thinking it's doing anything exceptional or out of the norm. Maybe it's a little bit too by the numbers. But I think that's kind of dismissing a lot of what it does well. It's not a book, I think, that is overly flashy with how it established itself, but I think there's a lot to really take away, especially because I think with a first issue, first issues are really difficult to write and get done well. Even great series don't always have good first issues, and some bad series have good first issues, unfortunately. But I think a first issue of a comic is actually much harder to do right than a first episode of a television series, for example, because I think you have a little, even less time to play with in a way where you have to establish characters, establish what the concept is, perhaps do some world building, give us an idea where this story is going, what is the story up, quote unquote, about, and then end someplace where you kind of want to keep going, a cliffhanger. And then when you're not even working with established characters like superheroes and get to do all that with one issue, it's challenging to do right. And sometimes you have a issue that's too much built upon character and you don't really have a conflict. Maybe it's too much world building and you don't really have one to care about. This, I think, it did a good job of kind of doing all those things, giving us characters to care about, establishing the conflict, giving us an idea of what this world is like and why it's different and unique, and ending on a really solid cliffhanger. Because by the time we get there, we know who these characters are, and kind of, even though we don't get to spend a huge amount of time with them, you kind of do care about them in a way. And I gotta say, a huge part of what really makes this book work is the art by Jorge Fornés. And it's not necessarily like he's doing anything out of the norm, but I love how he utilizes panels in this, and especially with this first issue. And he does this technique a lot throughout this issue, and we hear a lot of people talk about things like 9-panel grids, and in a way it felt like with this issue he was like working with a 12-panel grid in some instances. And I think that did a lot. This first page, I think, is great because there's no words. It's a great kind of cold open, bringing us in, establishing intrigue. We see this man go pick out this sandwich, bite into it, and right away there's a finger, which makes us wonder, why does this matter? Like, what is this leading to? What is this telling us? And how exactly did that happen? How did it get there? And we know one thing for sure: it's following through with the premise of, or at least what's on the cover, which is great because a lot of issues don't do that. A lot of issues, you'll see the cover and that never actually happens in the book itself. But from there, it jumps right into this kind of history of this family that we'll be working with or learning about, and we learn about their grandfather and how he was in World War II. He came back after that and kind of got with this woman who happened to be connected to the Lebanese mob, and he kind of ended up being brought into that mob. Not maybe he necessarily wanted to, but it was kind of something that was forced upon him. And we see that a lot with this issue, is like people having to do things they don't necessarily want to do but have to do for different reasons, and a lot of those things that they have to do are sometimes basic, like just being there for your family and having a after school job or doing some horrific things for the mob. It kind of runs the gamut of things that happen. I do love how in this first issue it talks about Vegas, and Vegas is the only thing that's actually colored in. I thought that was a nice little touch to kind of establish itself. And when we usually, with American films and comics or stories that talk about the mob, it's almost unanimously focused on the Italian mob. It's kind of nice to have it, focused on the Lebanese mob in a way, because it's not something that's often talked about. And also not taking place in New York City, taking place in Middle America, which makes it have, excuse me for a moment, I am fighting the worst head cold, so I do apologize. Having it take place in Middle America gives it almost this Coen Brothers-esque feel. And there's actually I felt like there's a lot of Coen Brothers in this, in a good way. Especially as I get to a few more things. But what we learned, though, is that background, that history was actually being told to us by the great-great-grandson, Ben. And we see a teacher who was a little bit taken back by that conversation, and it seems like Ben might be too much a fan of his violent family's past in a way. And we learned a lot about Ben. Ben is not necessarily the focal character of this issue, but we certainly get probably more insight into him than we do most characters. And we learned a little bit about the fact that there's a sequence with him trying to go out and get the attention of this girl to no avail. We also see that he has a decent relationship with his mom, and they seem to have a good back and forth and trusting of one another, which is good to see. Often when you have a story that focuses on teenagers, 9 times out of 10, teenagers and their families and their parents hate each other, in a way. With a son of a 3-year-old, it just has me concerned about what will happen in 10 years. But then we learn more about the father and his story. Again, utilizing that grid I talked about. Reading this, it had me wondering, what is this story, quote unquote, about? What is the deeper, quote, thematic meaning behind this? Which I'm not super sure of within the first issue, but I do find it interesting where you take this idea of this family. They own a deli, they're running this deli, and there's something wholesome about that in a way. There's something that's often you don't really think twice of a family owning a deli. It's a kind of common thing. But juxtaposing that with the mobster lifestyle, and kind of how they kind of coalesce with one another. And then, in a way, how it seems like he was brought up to kind of accept violence, maybe not just through people, but utilizing animals in a way. And again, the use of the air gun had me thinking back to something like No Country for Old Men or something like that. There's almost like a Western feel to it as well. And this is where we get kind of what the conflicts is going to be, as this family is trying to expand their territory and knowing that there's shady business going on. Anytime you try to expand, usually that it will lead to problems. The other piece we get throughout this is a story of a cop who is investigating this tractor trailer that was robbed, and we see her kind of asking different questions. And again, not to kind of beat a dead horse, but she too reminds me of a Coen Brothers character, very much reminiscent of someone like Frances McDormand in Fargo. That cop that some people might not take too seriously, but is much more capable than people give her credit for, and is really not going to just settle until she finds the answers of what she needs to do. And we have kind of all this kind of going along really nicely and paced really well, beat by bit. It kind of all interconnects, but not obviously, but nothing necessarily feels disconnected. And like I said, I love the page layout of that they have. And this sequence here is kind of hard to see. But I love how we see him walking down bit by bit with each panel, and it ends on a great bit. So great comedic bit as well. And this had a lot of great kind of off the wall comedy, some dark comedy. It's not super violent yet, but it feels like it's eventually going to get there, especially when you're dealing with a severed finger. But I love the use of shadow a lot in this, especially in this phone conversation here. Really establishes the atmosphere really well. We get a lot of characters in this, and I never feel lost though. I kind of understand everyone's place, where they are, who they are. No one's we have all these mob people, excuse me, and they're even though they're doing horrific things, it seems like they're all family men in a way. We have this character here who is not the nicest person in the world, but you see him taking photos of his daughter before she goes to prom. So it's just that normal, again, that juxtaposition of the normal life compared to that of kind of what's happening in the background. So I don't want to go further than that and give away what happens at the end, but I'll just say that it just progresses so nicely, and you can see what's happening, and you kind of get an idea where it's going. But again, I felt like everything about this really fascinating, and a lot of it was that art. I thought every page. It wasn't like Andre Sorrentino where going crazy with different panel designs, but just the use of kind of the grid in interesting ways, from the 12 panel grid to horizontal, using a lot of long horizontal shots, establishing shots. It kept the pace moving throughout the entire book. So I love this book. And again, like I said, it may not do some things that are going to jump off the page and amaze everyone, but what I like is a story. I like great characters. I like to feel like there's a lot going on in the story, and that's the case here. So it has my highest recommendations. Go out and check it out, and hopefully let me know what you think. But until then, just remember, comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, thanks for watching.